Hello everyone. Welcome you all again for today's webinar. Myself Anandan from Asia Leads Partnership. So today's webinar is on economic recovery and long-term visioning for the power sector transformation. So this webinar is organized under the grid-scale renewable energy communities of practice of the Asia Leads Partnership. So some housekeeping rules for today. Participants will be in mute mode for most of the time. We will have Q&A session towards end of all the presentations, and by when we will unmute you. During Q&A, you can raise hands. There is an option icon to raise hand. We'll then unmute specific participant. You're also encouraged to type in your questions at any point of time. You can also specify who the question is directed to which speaker. So under handouts section at the bottom, you can download today's presentation. Next slide. Ritvik, next slide, please. Okay. So here's a quick look at today's agenda. We'll give a very brief intro about Asia Leads Partnership and GRE Communities of Practice. Then we'll have the first technical presentation by Sadie Cox, expert from NREL. She will present on context setting of long-term visioning, economic recovery and framework to consider actions and investment in the power sector. This will be followed by a case study. Mr. Shantanu from Prayas, India will present on India's experience on the long-term power sector planning and economic recovery actions. So this will be followed by Q&A and discussion, and then we'll inform about next steps and the way forward. Next slide. So many of you know about Asia Leads Partnership and this GRE Communities of Practice. For new members, here is a quick overview. So the Asia Leads Partnership is a voluntary regional network that promotes low emission development strategy in the Asia and Pacific region. It is one of the 4 regional platforms of Let's Global Partnership. So Let's Global Partnership is hosted by GIZ within the support project of Paris Agreement supported by German government. It's a membership platform. It has more than 1,100 members, including 45 government ministries, agencies from 14 countries. ALP facilitates enhanced collaboration among government, other leads practitioners. It also fosters capacity building on priority topics. Next slide. Okay, so for sustained learning and peer-to-peer knowledge exchange, we have launched communities of practice on priority thematic areas. One such communities of practice is on grid-scale renewable energy. So it focuses on energy storage and long-term strategy for power sector transformation in the current year. Previously, it focused on grid-scale renewable energy. As the depending on members' needs, so this year we are focusing on energy storage and long-term strategies. So a COP is an interactive platform that brings together practitioners, experts, national, subnational governments, and enables peer-to-peer learning. As part of the communities of practice, we organize several online sessions, in-person workshops, etc., based on members' needs and priority. Resource materials are also developed. We share other tools and relevant materials for the benefit of COP members. As of now, there are 60 plus members from 11 countries as part of this COP. So several online sessions and in-person workshops have been organized so far under the GRE Communities of Practice. Case studies were also developed. In today's webinar, this will specifically focus on power sector transformation. As part of the new support area, that is this economic recovery and long-term power sector transformation, which is need of the hour. And through this webinar, we aim to work with countries on the development of more ambitious, longer-term visions for power sector transformation. We would support countries to integrate this long-term power sector visions with the economic recovery efforts. We also plan to technically support 1 or 2 early mover countries. Sadie, one of the speakers, will speak about this later in the presentation. So next slide. So other communities of practice run by shallots partnership are on clean mobility, NDC finance, and building energy efficiency. You can join any of these corps by submitting an online registration form. Yes, we also encourage you to become ALP members to keep updated about ALP activities. Next slide. Yeah, a brief introduction about today's speakers. We have Sadie Cox, who is a senior analyst in the Markets and Policy Group of Strategic Energy Analysis Center at the NREL, National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So Sadie's areas of expertise include renewable energy policy design and good practices, advancing technical solutions for resilient power systems, and assessing development and impacts of clean energy and climate actions. Welcome you, Sadie. We have the other speaker, Shantanu, who is a coordinator of Prayas Energy Group, which is a premier think tank and advocacy group in India. He has over 2 decades of working experience on a range of energy policy issues from techno-economic, legal, and broader public interest perspective. So at present, he is working on issues related to electricity sector restructuring and regulation. He has published several research reports and regularly participates in various regulatory and policy processes at the central and state level. Welcome, Shantanu. Now, may I invite Sadie to give her presentation. Over to you, Sadie.
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction, Anandan, and thanks so much to everyone for joining the webinar. My name is Sadie Cox, and as Anandan mentioned, I work at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado, and I do a lot of work with the LEDS Global Partnership. So today I'm happy to be introducing you all to a new topical area of focus and an area of support that we're planning to provide through the Asia LEDS Partnership Renewable Energy Grid Integration Community of Practice to support long-term low-carbon visioning in the power sector within the context of near-term economic recovery as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'd really like this to be more of a discussion, especially at the end, on what makes sense from all of your perspective for this type of support and on what countries may already be pursuing in these areas. So again, I hope at the end that you all will provide your perspectives as well as questions. So next slide. So I wanted to start with just a bit of context on economic recovery that will be, of course, occurring in relation to the current global situation. So it's expected that trillions of dollars will be flowing into economies to support economic recovery, and these investments will absolutely have major implications for the future. So in this context, we can work to avoid lock-in of carbon-intensive technologies and to align these investments with climate and clean energy goals where appropriate. So the community of practice, the Renewable Energy Grid Integration Community of Practice, will be offering support in this regard through working with an interested country to do some long-term visioning, to really inform these near-term investments in the power sector from a forward-looking perspective. And in addition to that, we'll be generating and supporting broader peer learning on this topic across the region. So next slide, please. So we've started to do a bit of research on impacts of previous recovery dollars spent and what actually works and what maybe doesn't work as well. So here I'll only focus on the renewable energy and energy efficiency investment impacts, since that will be of most interest for the webinar today. So just on the energy efficiency side, it's been found that a $1 million investment in building efficiency can create 8 full-time jobs. This is about 3 times the level compared to fossil fuel investments. Renewable energy investments have been found to create 50% more jobs than fossil fuels. IRENA also has been putting out some really good studies recently, kind of looking at some projections for the future in relation to RE investments in a post, coming out of COVID-19. And they've found that investing significantly in renewable energy could spur global GDP gains of $98 trillion between now and 2050, with 3 to 8 US dollar returns for each dollar invested. So In addition to that, there's also a lot of information on benefits associated with grid modernization investments. So it's been found that every $1 billion invested in grid modernization can create $2.4 billion in economic benefits related to jobs, reliability, and other areas. And so we've used a lot of different sources of information to bring together the information that you see here, and those are listed at the bottom of the slide. So next slide, please. So this slide just lays out a couple examples of the types of clean energy investments included in our past recovery efforts. And for the US, sorry, 1 second, I just had a computer thing. So in the US, you can see that investments in renewable energy and energy efficiency under our 2009 recovery program included things such as government building retrofits, weatherization programs for the residential sector, renewable energy actions to support investment through tax credits and loan guarantees, investments in grid modernization, so investments in both transmission capacity as well as deploying smart grid technologies. And then we've also highlighted here some of the renewable energy and energy efficiency investments that were made in Korea as well in 2010. So moving to the next slide. So building on what we've been learning about clean energy within recovery efforts, which we covered a bit on the last 2 slides, but we've been doing a lot of research in this area. But so kind of building on that, we've started to lay out some categories of the types of investments that countries might consider. And again, this is a very early framework, so we would be very happy to get all of your input on what we might be missing here, and more specific actions that your countries are considering for investment. So the first category of investment that we've included here is on infrastructure. So analysis and investment in various areas related to clean energy. So that could be power sector investments, transportation, buildings, industry, grid modernization, as well as other areas that would be unique to each country. Investments in innovation. So this would include research, development, and demonstration investments and pilots of new and innovative technologies. Investments in business incentive and financial support, so different types of actions to de-risk and mobilize investment. And then finally, actions related to workforce development, so partnering with local universities and continuing education programs to really build out the workforce that would be required to support these various investments in the clean energy sector. And then at the base of this framework, we've also presented resilience as kind of the foundation for all of these actions. So while you know, we hopefully won't have another pandemic anytime soon, there are of course many threats to the energy sector. So we think that it's really important for resilience to be kind of a key consideration and metric as countries are considering investments in economic recovery. So moving to the next slide, we now wanted to talk about options for collaboration through the grid integration community of practice to support, again, this long-term visioning that enables economic recovery. And also we will provide an example of a power sector transformation framework that we've developed through the Let's Go partnership that can be applied with countries or jurisdictions to support this type of visioning and near-term action in the power sector. So next slide. So the first option for support through the community of practice is really a more targeted support option that would include partnering with a country team to undertake a pretty rapid analysis of different visions and clean energy options, again, to support both economic recovery as well as longer term low carbon and resilience goals. And then based on that process to identify one prioritized action area where we could provide some further technical assistance. So this can include things like support for grid modernization analysis that could inform investments in grid modernization, potential support for design of clean energy incubators, which could be an area of emphasis under different types of recovery efforts. Or another example could be support for workforce development programs and design of those programs. So that's one of the options that we have here for collaboration with the community of practice. And then on the next slide, we've also presented here kind of a more comprehensive process to support countries on long-term visioning and economic recovery. And under this option, this would require additional funding and partnering with other institutions. But this would essentially be a more robust process to establish a stakeholder team, which would really lead this visioning process, support coordination and convening of various forums to support this power sector visioning aligned with economic recovery. And then from there to work to prioritize the highest impact actions that again can support the absolutely critical job creation in the near term, but also support those longer term climate goals as well. And then from there to develop a low carbon economic revitalization action plan, which would include those prioritized actions, and also to provide support for implementation of those actions as well. And then another important aspect of this approach would also be to support peer learning across countries as well in this area. So on the next slide, this just kind of elaborates on the support process slides a bit, and I just wanted to emphasize that the visioning work would really begin with countries identifying their most pressing objectives for the power sector, really based on the current context and urgent needs, but also seeking to align that where possible with these longer term goals. So through support to a country, we would develop and apply a framework to inform this visioning process and to identify pathways or combinations of pathways that the country may wish to pursue. And I'll actually turn now to walking through an example framework that could be used to support this work that I mentioned earlier that was developed through the LEDGE-GP. So on the next slide, again, this provides an example of a power sector visioning support framework that could be used within the process that I just laid out on the previous slides to support countries in identifying both near-term and long-term actions that align with their most important objectives and priorities. And this framework is drawn from a study that we published through the LEDGE partnership earlier this year on power sector transformation together with Shantanu Dixit, who's also going to be speaking next, as well as a number of other institutions. So essentially this framework would begin with working together with a country team to identify the highest priority power sector transformation objectives for the country. So this, of course, can include things like economic development and job creation, support for energy access, climate and environmental goals, resilience objectives, as well as objectives related to energy democratization and really responsiveness to kind of consumer demand around that. And then building on those objectives, kind of the next step within this framework is to consider different factors within a country or jurisdiction, which might inform the pathways that a country might want to consider under this long-term visioning process. So this would include things like availability of different types of renewable energy resources, an evaluation of kind of the key economic industries, looking at the market and institutional context within the country, analyzing grid characteristics, and also looking at vulnerabilities and threats to the power system as well. And then the next step within this process is to look at different types of technology innovation trends. So looking at technology costs over time for the technologies of most interest, and then using that information again to inform pathways that countries might want to consider. And then combining all of that information, which we've actually done within a spreadsheet tool, which I'll show in the next slide. This information can then be used to determine which power sector transformation pathways or combinations of pathways might a country want to emphasize. So the pathways that we present in the paper are the one that's highly focused on distributed energy resources, so that's the distributed energy resource revolution. One that's more focused on the utility scale bulk power side of the power system, so that's the bulk power transformation. One pathway that's really at the intersection of transmission and distribution, which I'll actually dive into a bit more in the upcoming slides. And then a pathway that can actually feed into all of those, which is more focused on a distributed transactional future. And this is one of the more forward-thinking pathways that's really focused on kind of peer exchange of energy and some of the pilots around that are occurring around the world. So moving on to the next slide. So I mentioned the spreadsheet tool before, and here this just shows one piece of that spreadsheet tool that I mentioned that kind of complements this framework. But I wanted to dive into just kind of an illustrative example of a country here. So within this example that I'm showing, this would be a country that may have prioritized economic development, particularly job growth, and resilience as the highest priority objectives for power sector transformation. And so this is, again, basically a screenshot of the tool that we developed to be complementary to that study and the framework that you just saw. And so within this tool, country stakeholders can begin to get a sense of which pathways might be most supportive of different objectives. And also the tool brings in those other factors that I showed on the last slide, but I won't get into that here today. But it allows stakeholders to begin to get a sense of which pathways might be most supportive of different objectives. And here that's indicated by the numbers assigned. And so in this example, the transmission and distribution interactivity pathway may be one that a country could choose to explore further based on alignment with their kind of highest priority objectives of economic development and resilience and energy security. So this slide just provides some characteristics of the different pathways presented under this framework. And here again, we'll go with the example of the transmission and distribution interactivity pathway. Based on the kind of objective alignment in the last slide. And you can see that some of the characteristics of that pathway include acceleration of distributed energy resource adoption, really integrated planning and coordination across transmission and distribution system operators, scale up and improvement of publicly available data on what's happening with the system in real time, and as well as forecasted needs, which again can feed into that coordination across the transmission and distribution system operators, as well as an increased presence of microgrids on the distribution side. And I won't go into the details of the other pathways here, but again, we have a very detailed study that dives into these pathways in a lot of detail. So this slide, building on the illustrative example that we're using, just presents some of the near-term investments and actions that a country might consider, again, to align with that transmission and distribution interactivity pathway. And so this could include things like investments in grid modernization to support this interaction between transmission and distribution systems, scaled up investment in distributed energy resources, and as well as workforce development to complement that investment, greater investment in mini grids and microgrids, especially for critical facilities, continued investments in bulk clean power, which again would complement the distributed energy resource investments, implementation of innovative clean energy finance programs, particularly for distributed energy resources. And then this pathway also kind of sets the stage for scale up of electric vehicles, which may also be an important aspect of transport visions and broader investment packages that countries might be considering for economic recovery. And so, sorry, on the next slide, I don't know if I've been saying next slide or not, but hopefully we're on slide, I think we're on the next slide. Yeah, so next slide. Great, thank you. So this slide presents some of the connections across distributed energy resources and economic development, since that's obviously a very important priority for countries at the moment. So based on a 2018 survey of solar jobs in the United States, it was estimated that residential installations require about 38.7 jobs per megawatt of installed capacity, and utility scale solar installations require about 3.3 jobs per megawatt. So you can see there that distributed energy resources are more job intensive. Investments in DER are more job intensive, so that could be appealing for countries within the current context. And then just also noting here that DER can also play an important role in providing power for large scale manufacturing facilities, which is of course another kind of key economic engine in many countries and in a key area in relation to economic development. So moving to the next slide, I won't say a lot about this slide other than to note that the power sector transformation framework that we've developed also provides a lot of detail on different actions and investments related to each pathway that countries may wish to consider over time. And so this slide just starts to lay some of those out, both in terms of, the actions that could be taken now, as well as, 5, 10, 20, and 30-year timeframes. So that was a quick introduction to the overall framework, which again, we would like to apply with one country through the community of practice to help to inform this long-term visioning for the power sector that's also very deeply rooted in the most urgent priorities for economic recovery as well. And so we feel like this framework could be adapted in various ways, and it's definitely meant to be very flexible to actually support that kind of work. So on this slide, this next slide on next steps, we, as I just mentioned, are hoping to partner with one country on use of this framework for long-term visioning aligned with economic recovery. So if you're interested in support in that area, you can feel free to send me an email, and we can also talk about it more at the end of the webinar today. We're planning to implement that work by the end of the year. We're also, as I mentioned, really happy to work together to improve and develop out further the framework that we presented, or to consider other frameworks for doing this sort of visioning exercise for the power sector. And then we'll also be working with the ALP Secretariat on some kind of broader peer learning across countries on what's worked well for clean energy economic recovery, and how that can be aligned with this work on longer term visioning. So I think that wraps up my slides. So now we will, and very happy to get your questions and thoughts at the end. I know that was a lot that I covered very quickly in a lot of different kind of topical areas. So, but now we'll move to a presentation from Shantanu Dixit from Prayas Energy in India, and he's going to walk us through how COVID-19 is currently impacting the power sector in India, and how they're currently pursuing longer term power sector planning in that country, which can provide some insights for work that other countries may wish to take forward, and for hopefully for the visioning and pathway activities that we'll be undertaking through the community of practice. So I'll hand it over now to Shantanu. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Sadie, and welcome to all. Am I audible, and can you see my slide set? Can you see my screen?
Yes, Mr. Shantanu, it's clear.
Yes. Yeah. So it's a pleasure to be here and share a few thoughts about the challenges that Indian power sector is facing, and what could be ways in terms of really leveraging opportunities in terms of developments in the renewable energy sector and energy storage sector. So I will try to cover some of these issues in the next 15 minutes. So here is the outline, broad outline of my presentation. First, I will start with giving a quick overview of the Indian power sector. Then I will move on to what impact COVID-19 and lockdown had on Indian energy power sector. Then we will have a quick review of the kind of results that some of the power sector modeling exercises have thrown up in the Indian context. Then I will move on to what are the challenges before the Indian electricity sector, and then what could be way out, or what are the policy options that one needs to consider while dealing with this situation in India. So here is the quick snapshot. Uh, India is a large country, and we have the power sector is in the concurrent list of constitution, meaning state governments as well as central government are responsible for decisions in the power sector. Then most of the transmission and distribution utilities are owned by state are in the state sector, owned by state governments. Most of the value chain in the sector is uh, works on cost plus model. There are regulatory norms to decide generation, transmission, and distribution cost, and the tariff is derived based on that. There is some kind of retail competition for large consumers who have load more than 1 megawatt. But overall, if we see, the total share of competition in the sector is about 10%. With that, that's the kind of short-term trading and short-term power procurement happens. But most of the power procurement and power sale business happens through long-term contracts, which are typically 25-year duration contracts. Coming to generation, India's total installed capacity is about 370 gigawatt. Nearly half of it is coal-based capacity. And in terms of capacity, renewable energy currently constitutes about 23% of the total installed capacity. And here, renewable energy means modern renewables, large, mainly wind and solar. In terms of generation, thermal generation, which is from coal and gas sector, accounts for about 76% of total generation, and renewable energy contributes about 10% of total share in generation. In terms of distribution sector, 51% of sales are to residential and agricultural consumers, and that is important because these are the sectors which are highly subsidized, and about 37% is to commercial and industrial consumers. Now, here I come to the issue of impact of COVID-19 on power sector. Here you can see how the demand in electricity has dropped significantly after the lockdown. Uh, in India, lockdown was announced on 24th of March, and you can see that after that there was significant drop in electricity demand because of complete standstill of commercial and industrial activity. The demand drop was about 20% or so. It was more pronounced in states which are having large industrial and commercial loads such as Maharashtra and Gujarat, and the impact was less on states which are largely having residential loads such as Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. So one of the impact of this kind of significant drop in demand from commercial and industrial consumers was also significant reduction in revenue for distribution companies, and because especially these are large cross subsidy paying consumers, so the working capital requirement of these distribution companies has increased very significantly. These companies faced significant problems in terms of meter reading, billing, and hence collection was also affected. Um, we'll come to that in terms of implications of this and what kind of relief measures government has announced to support distribution companies. But another point I want to highlight is since last about a month or so, India has started moving towards unlocking and reduced restrictions on industrial and commercial activity. And as you can see, the demand has slowly started coming back to normal. That is what the demand was in the last year. Of course, the demand should have been more than last year, because typically India sees about 5 to 7% increase in demand growth every year. So we are still not completely back to normal, but definitely demand has started picking up significantly in the last 1 month. Uh, Before I go to the kind of measures that government has announced to support distribution company, I just want to spend 2-3 minutes on this significant event that happened on 5th of April, where Indian Prime Minister announced a light off event as a mark of solidarity in this COVID times. And Prime Minister asked people to switch off lights for 9 minutes at 9 p.m. And this slide essentially captures the significant drop in demand because of massive response to this call. The demand dropped by about 31 gigawatt in just 10 minutes time. And fortunately, the system was able to manage this kind of very rapid drop in demand, and then again recovery in demand. And one of the key reasons for this was very significant flexible support provided by hydro generation. India has hydro capacity of about 40 gigawatt, and here you can see that that capacity was really put to good use in terms of meeting this kind of significant drop in demand at a very short duration. But it also highlights the uh, the limits in terms of the flexibility that the Indian grid has. Here you can see that the total drop in hydro generation was about 15 gigawatt. So for a system with installed capacity of 370 gigawatt, hydro flexibility is only limited to about 15 gigawatt. So it also highlights the kind of flexibility challenge that the grid will have to face if and when much larger renewable energy capacity is integrated into the Indian grid. Uh, so coming to the response provided by central government and various state governments in the context of COVID-19, the largest initiative is from the central government or the central sector, and that is essentially in the form of providing a very huge liquidity to distribution companies. Distribution companies have been facing severe financial stress, and as we'll see in some subsequent slides, it is not a recent phenomena or not just linked to COVID-19. It's a chronic long-term issue that distribution companies are facing. And as a result of this, there are huge unpaid bills to generating companies. Even though there are power purchase agreements, distribution companies are not able to pay generating companies on time. So to address this issue, the central government said that central government can infuse about 90,000 crore rupees into the distribution sector. That will be essentially in the form of loans given to distribution companies, and distribution companies are expected to use that liquidity to pay off generating companies. And there will be some reduction in interest cost to distribution companies because of this, but compared to the scale of operations, the interest saving is not that significant. In addition to this, some of the central government owned generating companies such as NTPC and transmission companies such as Power Grid are also offering some financial rebates and moratorium in terms of payment. So that will also give some financial relief to distribution companies. But again, in terms of total quantum, it's going to be very, very limited in terms of impact on distribution finances. Coming to state level initiatives, these are again initiatives mainly aimed at providing rebate or deferred recovery of fixed charges for commercial and industrial consumers, because these are the consumers which are hit hardest because of lockdown. Their entire revenue cycle has come to standstill. So some states such as Punjab, Gujarat, Maharashtra, have offered rebate or deferred recovery of monthly fixed charges for these consumers. Some regulatory commissions have provided special dispensation for distribution companies so that they can raise more capital, take more loans for meeting working capital requirements, and then the cost of that or the increased cost of that loan would be passed on to consumers over a period of time. So these are some of the initiatives at the central level as well as at the state government level to address essentially the financial stress that has come because of COVID-19 related economic slowdown and lockdown for more than 3 months. Uh, Now I will move on to uh, linking this to the overall Indian electricity sector and what are the challenges that the sector is facing. But before that, I will spend some time on the renewable energy sector and what is the status of renewable energy in India. As this slide shows, India has already reached modern renewable energy capacity of about 88 gigawatts, which is mostly wind and solar capacity and some small component of micro hydro and biomass based generation. Another 30 to 40 gigawatt is under construction. Government has set a target of 175 gigawatt by 2022, which would be about 21% of the total generation capacity, and more medium-term target of 450 gigawatt by 2030, which will be about 35 to 40% of the total generation capacity in the country. Now, to achieve these targets, all states and all distribution companies are given a renewable portfolio obligation, which is the mandatory component of renewable energy that all these distribution companies have to purchase. And that is also economically attractive for many distribution companies because over the years, wind and solar prices have really come down. You know, about a decade ago, it was about 11 rupees per unit, but in the recent auctions prices have come down to as low as about 2.5 to 3 rupees per kWh, which is about 3.5 to 4 cents, 4 US cents per kWh. And this is significantly lower than the cost of generation from new coal thermal plants. Simply on the basis of energy charges, there are other issues that definitely one needs to look at, and we will come to that in a minute. Mm, just and just 1 second, let me just go through the question. Enter into the second phase PPI. I mean, when the first. Yes, the question is about the tenure of PPA. The first tenure is 25 years. After 25 years, developers are free to sell electricity either through another PPA or they can sell it on open exchange and electricity market also. Uh, Oops, sorry, I think, yeah. So prices of wind and solar have come down very significantly in the last few years, and that is big advantage for distribution companies. And that is also reflected in some of the recent power sector modeling exercises that have been carried out by many agencies. So this slide simply summarizes some of these results. Here we are summarizing 5 such exercises carried out by agencies such as NREL and LBNL. They did a study in 2017 under Greening the Grid initiative, which was a pan-India study, and which looked at what could be the contribution in terms of 2022 of variable renewable energy in the Indian supply mix. And they found out that about 22% of energy contribution can be absorbed in economical manner. Then last year, Prayas did a very detailed dispatch modeling exercise for the state of Maharashtra. The terminal year was 2030, and there we found that renewable energy as high as 50% in energy terms can be absorbed in the Maharashtra system in a cost-effective manner. That means up to 50% of the renewable energy will also lead to optimal power purchase or power generation cost. Then one of the recent study that is being done by Terry again uses All India exercise and undertakes production cost simulation. As per this study, again by 2030 at the India level, renewable energy contribution could be about 25 to 32%, and that is again in economically optimal manner. Then another very significant study that recently came out is by Central Electricity Authority, which is the central government's nodal agency to undertake a variety of analysis for the electricity sector in India. And their recent report on optimal generation capacity mix for 2019, 2029, 30 shows that about 30% of the total energy can be generated from renewable energy, wind and solar, in cost-effective manner. Then again, some recent study by NREL under Reeds, using Reeds modeling platform that looked at much longer term scenario at 2047, and under different assumptions of cost in terms of wind and solar cost as well as cost of battery storage. The study finds that renewable energy contribution in the range of 54% to 72% might be economical under different cost scenarios. So essentially the point is a very significant contribution of renewable energy seems techno-economically feasible and desirable. So that's the essence of these studies, a variety of studies that are being carried out in the Indian context. Now, another facet that is supporting this techno-economic transformation is some of the recent results that India has seen in terms of bids for high capacity utilization factor renewable energy projects or peaking RE capacity. There was a tender issued by one of the central government agencies for uh, peaking renewable energy supply, allowing hybrid renewable energy sources, and the price discovered there was quite attractive compared to the new coal thermal generation price. Similarly, there was a recent tender for 400 megawatt for getting really high CUF from renewable energy project. That is again a combination of wind and solar was allowed under this tender, and there again for about 80% CUF on annual basis, that was the requirement, and the levelized tariff discovered was about 3 rupees 59 paise per unit. That is again slightly more than about 4.5 cents per unit, so which is again very attractive. Another very big tender of 5,000 megawatt asking for 80% minimum availability on annual basis with at least 51% of RE contribution is in the pipeline. The results are yet to be declared. But this essentially shows that even with high CUF and peaking RE capacity, prices are not very high and the tariff discovery is very, very competitive. Uh, Coming to the issue of battery energy storage systems, a recent study done by Prayas, it also shows that battery prices are coming down very significantly, and those also will be very economical in coming years. Uh, so essentially, what we are seeing in the last few years is some of the fundamental pillars of electricity sector are undergoing significant changes. It provides a very attractive techno-economic case and opportunity for power sector transition. But, and in my opinion, that but is a very important issue. We need to see where the sector is, whether the sector is in a position to actually successfully take benefit of these techno-economic opportunities. And unfortunately, in the Indian context, we find that there are several chronic problems faced by distribution companies, and which are impacting distribution sector viability in a very big way. And some of the causes for this financial viability of distribution companies is issues about power procurement, issues about operational inefficiency, and also about skewed tariff, which I will cover in the next few slides. So as this slide shows, it's a it has been a recurring feature of Indian power sector that every few years the central government or state governments have to offer significant financial bailout to distribution companies. So COVID related interventions or liquidity infusion is not a very new phenomena. India has been observing this kind of bailout packages over a number of years. And as you can see from this slide, the scale of these bailouts has been very, very significant. It's not a small financial support. So that's the real challenge for the distribution sector. How do you avoid this kind of recurring bailouts? Because unless the sector is financially viable, it will not be in a position to take real advantage of techno-economic attractiveness of renewable energy or battery storage systems which are rapidly coming up. Another challenge before the Indian power sector is the whole issue about the threat or the increasing competitiveness of alternate supply options compared to the distribution company's supply cost. As this slide shows, distribution company's average cost of supply is about 7 to 8 rupees per unit, whereas tariff for high consumption HT or LT industrial and commercial consumers is about 130% of this average cost of supply. So their tariff is about 10 rupees per unit, whereas cost of alternate supply in terms of purely energy cost is less than 4 rupees if one has to go for renewable energy based supply, or if one goes for rooftop energy, then still it is less than 4.5 rupees or 5 rupees for sure. And if we see a large part of non-agricultural, non-residential sales of these distribution companies are already, paying a tariff which is significantly higher than this 5 rupees. So there is significant threat for distribution companies that these C&I consumers may move out. They may reduce their supply from distribution company, and that's going to aggravate financial crisis for the distribution company. So the part to transition to a much more renewable energy based system will have to address this financial viability challenge of distribution companies, because unless this challenge is addressed, there is a danger that there may be significant stranded assets, there may be resource lock-in. If the companies are not financially viable, they may not be able to attract adequate investment in grid modernization or in terms of providing necessary credit support or investment support for new renewable energy projects. So this becomes a very significant challenge that needs to be addressed on the way to power sector transition. And the first point to that, I know I'm sort of exceeding my time limit, but I will just complete in 2-3 more minutes. The first thing is the policymakers need to recognize and plan for this changing role of distribution company from the current role where they are supplying to all consumers to a role where there will be multiple supply options for distribution for consumers. So that changing role needs to be clearly understood by policymakers. And here are some ways in which, or some specific ideas that one can think of in addressing this financial viability challenge for distribution companies. One is, the sector itself need to encourage long-term sales migration of large consumers so that they will be able to get electricity at competitive tariff, and the distribution companies will not face uncertainty of demand. Secondly, the distribution companies need to be really, really careful in entering new long-term baseload power purchase contracts, because if they enter into such new contracts, then there is significant danger that these distribution companies may get stuck with these contracts, which are going to be highly uneconomical and uncompetitive in near future. Agriculture, which is a significant cross subsidy burden for distribution companies, one can clearly think of shifting agriculture to solar, because it offers a very appropriate way of changing agricultural load to daytime when solar is able to meet this demand. And the cost of supplying agricultural load through measures such as agricultural solar feeders can be very economical and can lead to reduction in cross subsidy requirement. States such as Maharashtra, or even at the national level, there are programs under Kusum program to effectively take advantage of this reducing cost of solar based generation and use it for agriculture. So this kind of innovative measures need to be really scaled up and implemented across different states to reduce the burden of cross subsidy. Simultaneously, there needs to be innovative tariff design to address variability of renewable energy, seasonality of load. So variety of new ways in terms of tariff design also need to be tried out. There is a need to have there is need to develop robust markets, because that will allow different states and different open access consumers to actually take advantage of electricity through uh, different sources in a more efficient manner. Then one is to give attention to small consumers in terms of ensuring that they do not suffer because of poor supply quality. So essentially, it needs a comprehensive approach. Even though there is a significant techno-economic attractiveness and case for power sector transition, issues such as distribution companies or distribution sectors financial viability needs to be addressed. Unless that happens, the power sector transition will not be really fundamental or deeper. And this is my last slide. I'm not spending too much time on this, but as we discussed in detail about the challenge of financial viability of distribution companies, these are some of the other aspects that also one needs to keep in mind while looking at really long term and fundamental uh, transformation of the power sector, which is issues about socio-environmental aspects, how such large scale renewable energy development is going to impact environment, or what kind of social impacts it will happen, what are the linkages of this kind of transition to different or other sectors of economy, because coal is one of the very significant tax revenue earner for central government. So if that tax revenue reduces, then there need to be alternate tax revenue. So many other aspects also need to be seen to really have deeper and fundamental transition in the electricity sector. So I will stop with this last slide, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Shantanu. Yeah, hello everyone. This is Nikhil from the Asia Let's Partner. We'll be moving on to the questions now. Can we just have the next slide, please? And while we take the questions, since we have a number of country representatives from India, Nepal, Thailand, Turkey, Taiwan, Indonesia, Singapore, and Philippines, and some of you particularly are with the government ministries and institutions, so you can just mull over these as well. So we would just like to take questions which have come in from the audience first, starting with the question for Sadie. Some stakeholders promote use of integrated resource and resilience planning using tools like OpGen. How does this fit into power sector transformation? So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. So so the framework that we put forward and that we've developed is absolutely meant to be very flexible. So it can either be integrated with or informed by other processes and plans, such as integrated resource and resilience plans. So traditional IRPs have a kind of a little bit of a shorter time frame than what we're considering here with this visioning work. So maybe out to 10 or 20 years, whereas this framework is looking out more on like out to 30 years time horizon to really consider that kind of longer term forward thinking vision for the future. So I would see that an IRP process could potentially be integrated in some way with this type of longer term visioning process to really inform some of those what you might call nearer term actions over maybe 10 to 20 years. And then that broader visioning could then also feed back into the IRP process in some way. And I think also within the framework, we put forward a number of different objectives that country stakeholders might consider from a high level, which could also be integrated in some way with IRRP, or maybe there are also different types of metrics or objectives within those processes that could be adapted within our framework. So I would just say it's very flexible, and I think, you know, and as we work with countries, definitely the plans and strategies that they're already working with would absolutely inform this longer term visioning process.
Thank you, Sadie. And next we have a question for Shantanu. Yeah.
Yes, please.
This is a comment from Mr. Anjan Kumar Sinha, who's also previously been involved in a utility. So in India, he says that all the support sadly has been given to discoms and the consumers have not been considered. So any comment on this input?
Yes, especially there is no special dispensation for residential and agricultural consumers as of now. All the support has been to distribution companies, but as I said, in some states they have given concession to commercial and industrial consumers in terms of allowing them to defer their payment of fixed charges. So that is the limited benefit. But my point there again would be, if there is any further concession given to consumers, because we operate in a cost plus mechanism, you know, that's going to lead to increased revenue gap for distribution companies, and then again that will come back to consumers in subsequent years, either in the form of a regulatory asset along with carrying cost or increased tariff. So as long as the distribution companies are making losses, consumers will have to uh, sort of keep on addressing those losses. So the real key or the real benefit would be in terms of making distribution companies and generating companies more efficient and improve in terms of their planning, so that their cost of supply itself reduces, which would be the you know, long way to support consumers in long term.
Sure. Thank you, Shantanu. Yeah, one more question, a follow-up to the previous question on the PPAs, which you answered regarding signing a second PPA after the first PPA end. So to that, Mr. Dhital from ERC Nepal, he says that your answer suits when you have multiple buyers, but what is your suggestion when you have only one off-taker? What are your thoughts in terms of what a regulator could do in such situations?
Yeah. No, in such situation, because during the first tenure of PPA, entire cost of the project is recovered. One needs to see what was the termination provision in the PPA. If there is a provision that the PPA can be renewed, and if there are stipulated guidelines in that PPA, then those guidelines could be used. Or the other option could be to really do a cost plus exercise and see what is the remaining value of that asset and what is the cost required in terms of O&M. If there is some kind of modernization investment that needs to be done, then identify those costs and make this as a cost plus project, and enter into a new PPA, which typically should be at a much lesser tariff than original PPA, because most of the capital cost is already recovered during the tenure of first PPA. Just to give you some numbers, in India we had some cases where wind PPAs were signed for 11 or 13 years duration, and at the end of that duration, subsequent PPAs were signed, which were about you know, 1/3 to 20% of the tariff of first PPA, because wind projects essentially have no or very low variable cost. So the tariff for subsequent PPA was much lower than first 10-year PPA.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, we have one more question. Either Shantanu or Sadie, both can chip in here. So this is regarding how do you see the shift happening of distribution companies to ESCOMs, which I believe is energy service company.
Yeah, as I was showing in my slides, uh, the first thing is the distribution company's role need to change from uh, sort of complete service provider to largely a service provider in terms of wires provision, and as a provider of supply to small consumers who are not able to participate in retail competition and retail market. So that role transition needs to happen. And in terms of energy supply companies, or changing role from discoms to escoms, this will have to be essentially the distribution companies leadership looking at this as a new revenue stream, and they will have to be really efficient in delivering those energy services, because there are, at least I'm talking in the Indian context, there are going to be multiple suppliers, competitors to distribution company. So unless the distribution company is really efficient, it's going to be difficult for C&I consumers to actually use this energy services from distribution companies.
Thank you. Yeah, we maybe what we'll do now is we'll also take questions where participants want to speak, and we'll unmute you. You can also raise your hand, and we'll let you ask the question. So we again have one more question from Mr. Detal. We are unmuting you, sir. If you can just state your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to ask Santanu one more questions regarding, if the government makes an announcement saying that, okay, government will be, providing this much rebate, and government expects that, state-owned utility to pay from, its own profit. So what would be regulators' role in that case? Regulator is there to protect, investors' interest, protect, utilities, interest also. So should we, come in and say, no, this should be compensated by the government? So what is your, suggestions? You very clearly mentioned in India, government provides a kind of, soft loan. But in our case, government is saying, this much percentage will be provided to consumer. So in that case, how do we handle these things? Utility is in a difficult situation now.
Yes, I can very well imagine the scenario, because in India also in some states we are having a very similar situation. But essentially the whole thing will depend on what is the current legal structure and legal framework, because if the law allows government to provide certain kind of policy decisions or policy directives to either the regulatory commission or to distribution companies, then the government will have that authority, and then the regulatory commission will have to pass on those rebates to consumers, and the distribution companies profits to that extent will either reduce or uh, the recovery of those charges will have to be postponed to subsequent years. And then they may add some kind of carrying cost on that, some kind of interest cost on that, so that the distribution companies and investors don't face direct losses, but they may face some temporary liquidity challenge. So it really depends on what is the legal structure in that specific case.
Thank you. Got it. Thank you very much, Santanu. Yes. Go ahead.
Welcome.
Sure. Thank you for your questions and responses as well. Sadie, I think we can just move to the discussion points. Do you want to take this up?
Sure, yeah, thank you. So yeah, we wanted to just turn to you all now to get some of your information on your experiences or your reflections on kind of the topic that we covered at a high level at the beginning of the webinar. First, starting with any lessons that you all might like to share in relation to previous investments in clean energy related to economic or disaster recovery within your countries. Do you have any insights on different types of investment areas that were beneficial or had an overall positive impact, and just kind of what worked and what maybe didn't work as well? Also, any thoughts on how your country might already be considering linking economic recovery with longer term low carbon visions and climate goals? And then also just wanted to see if there was anything to share on any specific clean energy investments that that you all may be already considering within your countries to support economic recovery. So lots of areas that can be covered and discussed there. So hoping that folks might want to chime in and provide some thoughts.
Sure. Thank you, Sadie. Yeah, so we request all participants to please raise your hands if you want to chime in. Or if not, yeah, we can talk. We can pick out a few participants. Anyone from the countries, from Nepal probably, do you want to share inputs, or yeah, even from Taiwan?
Regarding, can I share you our experience, from Nepal, especially in renewable energy investment?
Yes, that would be great. Thank you.
No, I mean, before joining ERC, I used to head the organization called Alternative Energy Promotion Center. During my time, what we did was we had a kind of a national program, national rural and renewable energy program, and then in the past we used, the program, the government-owned agency, Alternative Energy Promotion Center, used to provide subsidy and the grant and the loan also. Now what we did was we actually separated the function. One, the fund-related activities was to be channelized through a dedicated central renewable energy fund, and with this, we could attract other fund, and we've been able to actually get accredited in the Green Climate Fund as well. So now we have an investment component and the technical assistance component. The technical assistance component brings private sector, the community together, whereas the fund, the Central Renewable Energy Fund provides both the subsidy as well as soft loan based on the financial viability of the projects. But the projects are brought to the table based on, again, they will be given some challenges and they need to compete. So this model, I think, especially in promoting renewable energy and distributed generations in rural area, has been very effective. And then when you make this case very successful, this you can actually upscale in a bigger way as well. We've been able to integrate those small systems into the regional grid and the central grid. So in the commission, we've also introduced, put a provision that the same rate, right, and in not only the same posted rate, but also if somebody wants to top in, then the viability gap funding also will be allowed. So that provision have been kind of made in the regulatory commission as well. So with these 5 big solar projects, especially utility scale solar projects, now are on a different stage of constructions. 2 have been already given permission. The power purchase agreement has been signed already.
Great, thank you. And just on that Central Renewable Energy Fund that you mentioned, is there any discussion of potentially expanding that within the current context of supporting economic recovery?
Yes, I mean, yes, this will be, now they are planning to convert this into a challenge fund. You know, because the subsidy will be provided by local government, but this will be converted into a kind of, you know, challenge fund located in the central federal level. And this, there will be amount especially for the you know, COVID related activities as well. I mean, the impact due to COVID.
Great, thanks so much for sharing that experience and how that's being expanded now in the current context. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah, do we have any reactions or inputs from any of the other participants from Taiwan, Sri Lanka as well, Indonesia? Does Kamini from Public Utilities Sri Lanka, do you want to say anything, or Mr. Anjan Kumar Sinha, any inputs? So I think, yeah, maybe we also happy to unmute, or if you can also type in your inputs on chat. Yeah, there's also a suggestion that we would also like to hear about power sector bailouts from the various countries. So if anyone has experiences to share. Yeah, Sadie, you were saying something?
Oh, I mean, I was just going to say that I guess, you know, people feel more comfortable following up by email after the webinar too with experiences that they might want to share in upcoming webinars or other questions that they have. That's possibility as well.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, perfectly. That works well as well. So we will, of course, we will follow up with these questions and also look forward to your inputs once you have time to mull over. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And I think, Sadie, if you have any other points to cover, we can take that up, or we can move to the closing slides.
Yeah, just wanted to remind everyone that if you are interested in working through the community of practice on this longer term visioning to inform power sector transformation and also near-term investments related to economic recovery in the power sector, we'd be happy to explore that further with you. So you can reach out to me by email or to Anandan at the ALP Secretariat. And yeah, just wanted to thank everyone so much for your time today, and look forward to further discussions. So thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Anandan.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sadie and Nikhil. Please note that one sec. Yes, okay. So please note that today's presentation and recording will be shared in email, and all the experiences will also be shared with the participants. We request you to share it with people in your circle and with the peer members. We also encourage you to join the GRE COP, GRE communities of practice, to get regular updates on the COP activities. As indicated by Sadie, we encourage developing countries and its representatives to write to us and express interest to receive the technical assistance on economic recovery and long-term power sector transformation. So initially, one country would be selected for offering support. We are aiming to develop visions for the selected country by the end of 2020. And as part of this new support area, we will continue to share tools, resources, material, and also the learning from other countries on clean energy and economic recovery. We will continue to do that. And as this GRE COP is member driven, please let us know your needs and priorities so that the COP activities can be customized accordingly. At the end of the webinar, a survey question will pop up. Kindly take a couple of minutes to complete it, so that will also help us in designing future sessions. We take this opportunity to thank all the participants, and a very big thank to the speakers for the insightful presentations. Thank you so much, Sadie and Shantanu. If the participants have any further questions in the topics discussed today, please reach out to us or the speakers. So before we wind up, Shantanu and Sadie, do you have any final remarks?
No, just wanted to say thank you for this opportunity to share a few thoughts with all of you, and it was nice experience. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Shantanu. Sadie, you
Yes.
have any points? Sure.
Just also wanted to thank Shantanu for his time today and delivering his presentation. I think we had a lot of great questions related to what he presented, and yeah, just thank everyone again for a great webinar. And now I'm off to bed because it's 10:30 p.m. here. So
Yeah.
hope you all
So
have a
much.
great day.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Have a good time. Thank you.
Thank you, participants
Bye-bye.
and attendees. We'll be sharing all inputs that we receive post the webinar as well with all of you. Thank you.